Karam, who was peacefully sleeping on the couch, heard Sarika's voice and began to feel as if someone was talking about her. Several minutes later, small dragon wings grew on the little dragon girl's back, along with a small tail. Upon seeing this, Sarika thought that she was growing scarily fast. The dragon girl approached Sarika, placed her hands on her abdomen, lifted her head towards her, and with a tender look began to gaze into her eyes. Sarika hadn't seen her for a moment, and she had already grown so much. Sarika crossed her arms, and while her body was emitting a terrifying aura, she started looking at the dragon girl, and explained to Cyan that it would depend on him how to handle something he had acquired during a mission. She also added that someone like her would be difficult to manage. Cyan placed a hand on his waist, closed his eyes, and calmly explained to Sarika that Brian was in charge of taking care of the girl. Upon hearing this, Brian, who was standing behind Cyan wearing a maid dress, became somewhat confused. He started pointing at himself with his finger and couldn't help but wonder if Cyan was really assigning him as the person responsible for taking care of the girl. Cyan also added that there was a barrier installed in the dorm, so detecting Karam's presence and that of this kid was going to be very difficult. Just before he could finish speaking, Sarika interrupted him. She took out a red-colored letter from her pocket with her hand and decided to trust him. She told him that she was going to trust him as long as he didn't cause any problems. After saying this, she handed it over to Cyan. He took the letter with his hand, brought it close to his face, and upon seeing the seal, he realized who had sent it. Upon seeing this, his expression drastically changed. While a drop of sweat was falling from his face, he began to look at the letter and couldn't help but think that receiving a letter like this as a reward for winning the duel was quite disappointing. While he was lost in his thoughts, Sarika opened the door, turned her back to him, slightly turned her head towards him and asked him to please be careful for a while. Upon hearing her voice, Cyan snapped out of his trance, lifted his head towards her, and began to wonder what she was talking about. She started staring into his eyes intently and explained to him that nothing good would come from receiving too much attention. Several minutes later, Sarika left his dorm. While Karam was peacefully sleeping on the couch, the dragon girl started circling around them. Brian approached Cyan, placed his hands on his abdomen, turned his head towards him and asked what it was. Cyan began to open the letter using both hands and revealed to Brian that it was a warning letter. Brian became somewhat confused as he didn't know what a warning letter was, so he asked Cyan what it was. After reading the letter, Cyan began to put it back into the envelope. Then, he turned his head slightly towards Brian, started looking into his eyes, and with a smile, explained that the letter was telling them that they were going to be expelled for misbehaving. Upon hearing that they were going to be expelled, Brian couldn't help but panic and start sweating. The dragon girl, who despite being only 1 week old, also understood Cyan perfectly. She started imitating Brian. She clenched both fists, raised her head towards him, and with a worried look called him Dad and asked what they were going to do now, and if they were going to end up living on the streets. Upon hearing this, Cyan turned his head towards her and became somewhat confused. He couldn't help but wonder where she had learned to say these things. He didn't even know if she knew what they meant. Thinking about this, he had no doubt that she was growing up too fast. The dragon girl, who had clenched fists and was looking at Cyan with a determined gaze, became somewhat confused upon seeing his expression. Cyan put his hand on her head, started to caress her, and reassured her not to worry because they were not going to be expelled and they were not going to end up living on the streets. Brian wasn't so sure about this. He dropped his arms and started approaching Cyan. He asked him if he was sure that everything was going to be okay. He knew that if he returned to Velia's, he would be punished. While Cyan was stroking the dragon girl's head, with a calm look, he asked Brian not to worry because he was going to file a complaint. With a serious look, Cyan remembered that the letter had the dean's signature. He knew that the dean had personally sent the letter and not the administration office, which meant that the dean wanted to talk to him. In his past life, the same thing happened. The dean called Cyan into his office and with a serious look asked if he wanted to join the Knights of Light and also if he had finally decided to live for the good of his brother. Cyan, who had his arms behind his back, began to look down at the ground with a serious expression and responded yes. Upon looking at Cyan more closely, the dean realized that this did not seem to be the most suitable path for him. Upon hearing this, Cyan raised his head, stared directly into his eyes, and remained silent. The dean placed both hands on the table, intertwined his fingers, began to look at Cyan and assumed that he had also realized this. He decided to give him some advice. With a serious look, he explained to Cyan that nothing good would come from taking this path. Whether he faced trials or endured a cruel fate, this path would not benefit him in any way. He knew that Cyan was going to end up living as someone's puppet, and the outcome wouldn't matter. He would always end up blaming his brother. While Cyan was stroking her head, he began to remember Dean's words and couldn't help but close his eyes, clench his teeth tightly, and become enraged. He started wondering what the Dean was going to tell him this time. Upon seeing that Cyan was starting to get angry, the dragon girl became somewhat confused. While Brian had his hand resting on his waist, he approached Cyan, turned his head towards him, started looking at the dragon girl and asked if they shouldn't give her a name. While with one hand Cyan was caressing her, he placed his other hand on his knee, turned his head towards Brian, and while slowly getting up, he asked him what he meant by giving her a name. Upon hearing this, Brian reached out to her and explained to him that they couldn't continue calling her kid. Without thinking too much, Cyan decided to call her Nana. He turned his body towards Brian, looked into his eyes, and asked him what he thought of this name. Brian was somewhat confused. He knew that this name wasn't good. He raised his palms to indicate to Cyan that no, then he asked him to please think of another name. Just before Brian could finish speaking, the dragon girl interrupted him. She clenched her fists tightly, approached Cyan, and began to look at him with an astonished expression. She told him that Nana was a good name for her because it remained the same when spelled backwards. Now she wanted to be called Nana Vert. She couldn't help but feel happy. She closed her eyes and started spinning around Cyan with a smile on her face. He placed his hands on his hips, closed his eyes, and felt somewhat surprised and confused at the same time since he didn't know how this girl knew his last name. Upon seeing that the girl liked the name Nana, Brian put his hands on his face and thought that everything was over, as now she would be harassed by other children. At the same time, while the Dean of the Royal Academy was sitting in his office, sun rays began to enter through the window. His table was full of books, and he was writing a letter. Several seconds later, he began to stare at the letter and couldn't help but get distracted and think about Cyan. He knew perfectly well that he had a lot of potential. He closed his eyes and started to remember the duel when Cyan had absorbed Seth's attack using the Dark Sphere. For Dean, someone who could absorb a 4-star spell using a 1-star Black Sphere had astonishing talent. With a serious look, he began to stare at the black door of the office and remembered that it didn't seem like Cyan had taken much effort to absorb the attack. He wanted to know his limits. Kundal Quaisel had taught the current emperor, Dione Severus, and was also the father of the last empress, Diana Quaisel. Quaisel was one of the few 9-star mages on the continent. After Diana Quaisel's death, he had focused solely on educating students at the academy. At the same time, Cyan put his hands in his pants pockets and began walking down the hallway connected to the dean's office. There was something he wanted to know about him. Cyan had always thought that the dean was a pacifist. But in this life, suddenly he had intervened in the struggle for royal succession. He wanted to know what he was really plotting. At that moment, Cyan raised his head and upon seeing what was in front of him, he was somewhat surprised. While a gust of wind was circulating through the hallway, Cyan took his hands out of his pants pockets, started looking at the dean's office door and thought that his personality hadn't changed at all. Cyan reached his hand forward and a magical barrier in orange color became visible. He tapped the magical barrier with his finger, and it began to emit a powerful energy. Upon seeing this, he quickly realized that this barrier was made to prevent him from entering the office. He began to stare fixedly at the magical barrier and couldn't help but smile. Dean knew that Cyan was going to arrive, and yet he had still placed a 9-star area restriction barrier. While the magical barrier was shining, Cyan thought that if this was an exam, then he should take it. The Dean didn't take long to feel Cyan's presence and couldn't help but smile. While he was stroking his beard, he began to stare at the door intently, and with a serious look on his face, he started wondering what Cyan was going to do now, since only a great mage could destroy such a powerful barrier. At that moment, the window behind Dean shattered into pieces. The person who had broken it was Cyan. He broke the window, started covering his head with his elbow, and began entering his office. Upon hearing the sound of the window breaking, Dean couldn't help but panic and go into shock. While little by little the pieces of glass from the window were falling to the ground, Cyan landed on the floor. He supported a fist and a knee on the ground, placed his other hand on his other knee, lowered his head and began to look at the ground. The Dean, who had his hand resting on the table, simply started staring at him and remained silent. Cyan turned slightly towards Dean Kundal, and with a penetrating gaze, introduced himself as Cyan Vert, an incoming student. He also added that he had come to express his disagreement with the complaint. After saying this, he stood up, clenched his fist tightly, turned his body towards the Dean, and simply remained silent. The Dean placed both hands on the table, intertwined his fingers, began to look towards the table, and upon seeing that he had ignored the barrier and entered through the window, he thought he had lost this one. He raised his head towards Cyan and with a calm look asked if he was talking about the warning letter. Upon seeing this, Cyan calmed down and with a calm look, he responded affirmatively, explaining that he knew the letter came from him. He also added that after seeing the barrier outside, he had made sure of one thing. He asked the dean if the warning letter was just a pretext to test his talent. The dean couldn't help but be somewhat amazed. He started looking at Cyan and replied yes, adding that entering through the window had been quite aggressive. With this, Cyan had successfully demonstrated his talents. After saying this, he closed his eyes, started pointing at the ceiling with his finger and told him that he was not going to withdraw the warning. He wanted Cyan to try to persuade him otherwise. Cyan began looking at him and became somewhat confused. He crossed his arms and asked him if he could ask a question. The dean answered yes. With a serious look, Cyan began to stare into his eyes and asked him if he desired the expansion of the empire or wanted honor for his family. Upon hearing this, the expression on the dean's face changed drastically. He started looking at Cyan with a serious gaze and couldn't help but be on alert and wonder how he dared to ask this question. While he had one hand resting on the letters, with the other he picked up the pen and began writing another letter. He praised Cyan for asking a rather bold question, but he responded that it was not his concern. Cyan, who was standing in front of his table with crossed arms, started staring into his eyes and upon seeing that he didn't want to answer this question, decided to ask another one. He asked if after Emperor Dione's death, if the third or fourth prince tried to take the throne instead of the first prince, would he remain neutral? Upon hearing this, the dean's expression once again drastically changed. He began to stare at Cyan with a murderous look and thought that not only was he audacious, but also arrogant. Cyan started to gaze at the dean with a serious look and remembered that he himself had been a puppet for Ashel. He thought that the dean wasn't very different from his past self. In Cyan's past life, during the struggle for the throne succession, Kundal had a great influence in making the first prince, Luinel Severus, become emperor. Luinel was a cruel and evil man who killed all his brothers. When Kundal opposed this, Luinel accused him of being a traitor to the empire, and he was sentenced to death. He had worked to brighten someone else's future, but in the end he had only ended up being betrayed by this same person. In a matter of seconds, the dean lost his composure, forcefully hitting the table with his palm and asking Cyan to stop talking nonsense. He stood up, extended his hand to the side, began to stare at him intently and asked him if he believed that the peace of the last century would fall so easily. He had thought that Cyan was a genius, but now for him, he was nothing more than a fool. Cyan, who had his arms crossed, simply remained calm. He started looking at the dean and asked him if he really believed this. He revealed to him that the mother of the first prince and the second princess had died from an illness, and the third and fourth princes were also good matches for the first prince. The Nepalis family, from which Empress Cassandra originated, was well known for being power-hungry. After revealing this, Cyan placed a hand on his waist, began pointing towards the ceiling with his other finger, closed his eyes and explained that this family would do whatever it took to maintain their position of power. In Cyan's opinion, the empire's peace was already hanging by a thread. Cyan opened his eyes, began to stare at the dean, extended his hand towards him and with a smile revealed to him that the day peace would fall, this academy would end. Upon hearing this, the dean couldn't help but be shocked. He started looking at Cyan with a surprised look and couldn't help but wonder if this was really the thought process of an 11-year-old child. He knew every detail of the current political climate. He stood up, started moving away from the chair, and asked Cyan with what intention he was telling him this. Cyan simply began pointing at him and calmly replied that it was to negotiate. He began to look at him and with a pleasant smile, he explained that he was here to help him with his family's peace and also the academy's. The dean simply started looking down at the ground and remained silent. Cyan asked him please to withdraw the warning. The dean didn't say anything and remained still, and upon seeing this, Cyan became somewhat confused as he didn't know what he was plotting. At that moment, the ceiling of the office began to glow. In the blink of an eye, a magic circle appeared on the ceiling. The dean put his hands behind his back, looked to one side, and asked Cyan what power he had to help him. Upon seeing the magic circle, Cyan became alert, clenched his fist tightly, and took several steps back. As Dean's body was surrounded by powerful mana, he turned his head towards Cyan and with a murderous look, lowered the finger of his hand and asked him to feel the weight of his arrogance. At that moment, several chains made of mana began to descend from the magic circle on the ceiling. This ability was called Chains of Judgment. In the blink of an eye, the chains wrapped around Cyan's body. Instead of becoming alert, Cyan got excited. He lifted his head towards the dean and started looking at him with a murderous look. He clenched his teeth tightly and asked him if he wanted to fight. This is the end of the video. If you guys want to see the next part, then don't forget to subscribe and like the video.